Oh, get used to it, Wayne. It's 6 days like this.
Which is titled Fair Use, Fair Fee, or Fair in Love, War and Documentary. We were discussing before, Simon and I, that it's possibly the number one sexiest topic here at AIDC, fair use. It's got to be, which is why you're all here. So we're very happy to see you. And we're very happy to have this panel today, which we've kind of pulled together, and which is very lucky to have these panellists. I'm going to give a bit of an introduction for them. First, I'm just going to give a bit of an introduction to myself and a bit of a kind of context for what kind of led up to convening this panel and kind of the broad context for this discussion. I'm also just going to ask a kind of couple of quick questions of you guys in the audience and how it relates to the inquiry. So my name's Rory Elkington. I've worked for 5 years in film distribution with Antidote Films and with Gilscrine Films and with Cinema Ventures and with Beamer Film. But in the last year or so, I kind of wound that back to focus on some research that I do looking at the education market for documentary. And what I mean by that is looking at education as a space that documentary makers distribute and sell their work into. And I'm kind of guessing that there's some perhaps documentary makers or producers or broadcasters that are involved in that space here, and hopefully that's kind of led you into this conference room today. So in kind of looking at that space, you know, one of the things I sort of approached was you follow the money. You kind of try to find out where money is sort of flowing from the education space. Now, screen rights is one of those. Can you just have a quick show of hands? Everyone who's got projects registered with screen rights here? A couple. Okay. So when you look at kind of the education space, it's clear that screen rights and the statutory licenses that screen rights works with is one way that education generates money for the documentary sector. There's other ones as well, but screen rights is certainly one of them. Hence, screen rights participation here today. The other thing that sort of happened in the last year, and I might try and just give you a brief timeline for the Australian Law Reform Commission into Copyright and the Digital Economy, which is a bit of a mouthful, but last year a issue paper was released in August, and then there was a discussion paper that was put out in June, and then there were submissions to the discussion paper, and then the ALRC reported on the 30th November in 2013, and then the final report was tabled to Parliament on the 13th of Feb. So we've had this long involved process for a really big overarching inquiry into copyright and the digital economy. Now, it's like a 474-page report. Has anyone actually tried to look at the thing? Has anyone actually? Yes, good. 2 hands, 3 hands, 4 hands here. It's a doorstop. It's a monster. We're not going to attempt to kind of unpack it in the course of this session. We're going to focus quite specifically within education, within the recommendations of the report and how it relates to the documentary sector. So I hope the kind of focus of this session is kind of clear for people. So that's a bit of background for both me and how this kind of panel came into being. So I'm going to give some introductions for our panel that we have today. We're very lucky to have Simon Lake, I do apologise, Simon, from Screen Rights. So Simon is the Chief Executive of Screen Rights, a non-profit audiovisual collecting society which collects royalties for owners of copyright in film and TV and facilitates access for educational institutions, governments, departments and the retransmission of broadcast television. Simon is on the board of Enhanced TV and the Australian Copyright Council. Previously, Simon was on the board of AGIOCA, the International Retransmission Collecting Society, the Executive Director of the Australian Writers Guild, and is also the Executive Director of AWG-ACS, the Australian Writers Guild Authorship Collecting Society. Simon was also on the board of the Sydney Film Festival and is actively involved in a range of voluntary work, including mentoring initiatives and volunteering at an emergency housing centre. Simon has also worked in a range of legal and policy positions, including as a Judge's Associate to Michael Kirby, when he was President of the New South Wales Court of Appeal. So thank you, Simon, for coming along today. So at the last minute, Jessica Smith kindly came through for us and flew in. Unfortunately, Delia Brown is unwell, but we're very lucky to have Jessica with us today. She is the National Copyright Officer for the National Copyright Unit, NCU, of the Standing Council on School Education and Early Childhood. So the NCU advises and represents Australian schools and TAFEs on copyright issues, negotiates copyright licences for the sector, and liaises with education, industry and government on copyright policy issues. The NCU also manages the Smart Copying website, which some people may be familiar with, which is a practical resource on copyright for Australian educators. And finally, last but not least, we're very happy to have Veronica Fury with us. So Veronica is an award-winning producer and company director of Fury Productions. Actually, I'm reading from an old bio here. It's about to change into something else. Well, I'll read this bit then. While Fury has a large number of documentary projects in various stages of production, including The Coral Triangle, Wild Australia, Big Red, Australia Land and Landscape, When the Queen Comes to Town with Foxtel. Veronica's a super busy production person, it's clear. So we're very lucky to have her here. So please welcome our panel for us today. Thank you. So I hope from that introduction it's clear that we've kind of got a representative from Screenwrites, we've got a representative from who's sort of worked with schools and is able to speak from the school's perspective, and a representative kind of producers. So my kind of opening question, I guess, which I'll kind of put to you, Simon, is, when you look at the report and the inquiry, which is, this big, large inquiry, but if we can kind of try and focus it down to education, what do you think are kind of the issues that motivated the report from Screenwrites' perspective?
It's an interesting question as to where something starts, because that influences where it finished.
Sure.
And I have a look at what happened in England, where they had a sort of a similar process called the Hargreaves Review, and they looked at specific licensing issues. Why couldn't consumers do certain things, or what was not available to be licensed, and so forth. With the ALRC, they actually started off from a very hypothetical point of view. They said let's review exceptions to the Copyright Act, but they didn't actually sort of ever ask the core question: what is it that we want to do that we can't do now, and how do we get there? And instead they asked this hypothetical question around exceptions, and hence they got a hypothetical answer. And so for us, that's the nub of the problem, is that they didn't really engage with the here and now and what consumers want. And so for us, the big things which came out of the report was that first of all, they started off saying, let's get rid of the statutory licences, because we think that fair use is the answer for all these questions. But the more they looked at it, the more that individual teachers said, hey, we want sort of simplicity, we want the access which the statutory licences provide. And also we had a lot of support, which was fantastic, from the film industry, from the broadcasters, from SPA, from ADG, from everybody pretty much sort of saying these royalties are important, and what we don't want to do is swap the certainty that we've got for the uncertainty of fair use. So the major proposal was to keep the statutory licences, to actually first of all they said let's introduce fair use, which for those that don't know, it's just going to talk a little bit more about it, but it's a US concept, and very much rooted in US law, US constitutional law, and what it tries to provide is a flexible defence. And they looked at that, and the ALRC said, well, maybe we can't politically get that through, and the Attorney General has indicated that he's not minded to go for fair use. So maybe we will go for what's called a fair dealing, where they have a list of prescribed purposes for education, including education, which might impact our licence. So we're looking at it, and we're trying our best to sort of look at the positives within the report and to look at where we can improve. But we really feel that the report missed a chance, and so we're trying to sort of backpedal and make up for that.
Okay, I might come back a little bit on that chance that sort of you see it missed from the report. But I guess, Jessica, it'd be good to bring you in at that stage. I mean, again, the same question really that I posed to Simon. I mean, what do you, from your discussions with schools, what do you kind of feel that were the motivations for the inquiry in the first place?
Yeah, I think, can everyone hear me?
Oh, sorry. Well, let's just have it anyway.
Okay.
There we go.
Sorry.
It's okay.
I think it's good to go.
Can you hear me? Perfect. So I think a lot of the problem was, and I think almost all sectors agree, that the Copyright Act in its current state is complex and confusing and hard to understand. How many pages is it? 600?
A lot.
500?
Not as long as the report.
It's outrageous. It's very long. I mean, it takes 10 lawyers to understand what one sentence means. I mean, where does that put teachers who are extremely time pressed and they don't have the time, and they want to care about copyright, but they don't have the time, and it's very secondary compared to they're there to teach. So I think that's really what spurred this review. We've had previous reviews that did look at it more holistically and what do we need out of our Copyright Act. I think this review was specifically looking at exceptions and whether what we have currently is adequate and appropriate in the digital age. And the ALRC looked at that for 2 years. And Jill McHugh, who was the head of the ALRC, this review, she said, I had no idea where I was going to come out whenever we started this review. Over 2 years in hundreds of stakeholder conferences and consultations and just tons and tons of evidence. There were 400, 500 submissions to the discussion paper. I mean, just the outpouring of people who wanted to say their opinion was just outrageous. And, they came out with, we think fair use is the best way for Australia. And they came out with that because it's technology neutral, it's flexible. We don't have to. One of the biggest problems with our Copyright Act now is that we've gone in there and we've edited it here and there in 2006, 2008, in little bits. We've just done it so piecemeal, and we need something that we can work with now and 40, 50, 60 years down the road. And it is a U.S. invention, if you want to say that, but so many countries have it now. Israel, Singapore, Canada has a very similar exception. So it's not just in the U.S., and I don't believe that it's fundamentally tied to the U.S. Constitution. I think it's there for anyone to use, and I think it's a great principle, and I think Australia would do perfectly fine with it.
I just wonder whether at this stage, just because we're talking about fair use, whether I can just pose to the audience, are people clear on the distinction between fair use and fair dealing? And I wonder if anyone on the panel would like to take a stab at making that distinction for us.
Yeah, so it doesn't have to be this way, but currently in Australia we have a fair dealing, and it's a fair dealing for very specific purposes. So for criticism, for review, there's 4 or 5 of them, and they're very, very, very prescriptive, and they're only for that specific item. So you can't look at it for broader reasons. It's what people call it. They call it. It's not flexible, and it's also very technology specific. So whenever we talk about fair use, we talk about a principle that has no specific bounds, no specific ceilings. It can be applied across the board. And it has 4 factors that you look at, and you weigh up those 4 factors to see whether a use is considered fair. And so they say it's simple, and the only question you have to ask is it fair? And you look at all these principles and these illustrative purposes to try to determine whether a use is fair.
Yeah.
Is it good enough?
In sort of doing my little summary, I mean, it's a huge report. I sort of latched onto this one sort of sentence, which does give, I think, it speaks to kind of the complication and sort of wordiness that really kind of throws up against people a little bit. So I'll share it with you. Applying this exception would also require consideration of what is fair, having regard to the fairness factors in the fair use exception. This is dense stuff. It is. I mean, it's kind of, we've got to kind of get amongst it and unpack it in a certain way. But I just want to kind of hope that sort of clarifies the difference between what Australia currently works under, which is fair use exceptions, and the possible fair use clause that might come in.
Just a quick question while we're on that topic
Sure.
of fair dealing. Can I just ask to what extent...
Sorry, mate, if we could just wait for the... Yep, thank you. And so just before you ask that question, by all means, please do interrupt at any stage. We will have time at the end, but thank you for that.
Just on topic. I'm an independent filmmaker, and I'm looking particularly at corporate and government behaviour. So I'm looking at using content that those entities have produced in a production, in some cases without their permission, for the purposes of criticism. But as someone who may be perceived as a political agitator, I'm obviously aware of the potential litigation which may follow. To what extent has fair dealing been tested in the Australian courts? And can any of you share any experiences on that front?
Yeah, do you want me to go or do
You can go first.
the question? It's a great question. It gets to the nub of what our concern is, because ultimately, it's only the courts that can decide what is a fair use or a fair dealing, and there have been many cases. It's actually one of the reasons why the big media companies don't want to move to fair use. They've spent literally tens of millions of dollars trying to work out the boundaries as to what is and what isn't. And so there was a very famous panel case which went all the way up to the High Court and back again. So media, particularly media lawyers, are well used to sort of working in the area as to what is and what isn't a fair dealing. And one of the things about fair use, it is actually it's in 4 countries at the moment. But one of the things about it is that the ultimate test, you can have guidelines, you can have all sorts of things, but we actually went to a very famous law professor in the US from Columbia University, a woman called Jane Ginsburg, and we asked her, how does fair use work in the States? And she said and that these reports are all part of the ALRC process, and she said to us, look, when you get flexibility, the corollary of it is you get uncertainty, and the only way for that uncertainty to ultimately be decided is through the courts. And then she looked at the cases, and there's a whole heap of academic sort of writing around this, going both sides. Some say, look, this can be codified, and definitely, everybody knows what they're dealing with here. And others, such as Jane Ginsburg, who looked at it in the education area, she says, look, you have a look at the cases, and they're all really closely decided, 3, 4 or whatever. They get overturned, they get moved, and so forth. So from our perspective, we look at it and we think what you're doing is swapping certainty for uncertainty, and there are answers around this, and we're talking about the digital economy, which was, sorry, I should have said that, ultimately one of the drivers was how can we best interact with the digital economy as a country. But if we're looking at these issues, someone like yourself is not going to have necessarily the resources to be able to go up and test it back and forth, and so that is a real issue, that all that existing law might be put aside and have to start again. And that's why I've said that it started off as a very academic exercise, driven in part by Google, and when they looked at this issue in the UK, even David Cameron was saying, this issue is looked at as the Google inquiry. So Google they've got their model of, this fair use here, this is the way in which it works in the States, therefore it should work that way everywhere else. And they want to put themselves, not just Google, but large institutional users, in the foot. Again, Jane Ginsburg talks about this, about putting large institutional users putting themselves in the shoes of individual users, and you can see the result of that with Google Books and other large fair use uses, where you've got this massive power imbalance between a huge institution whose money is more gained through indexing and advertising rather than content creation and being sustained. So there are advantages with the flexibility, but against that, there's working out where the limits are and how that should occur. And just one of the big changes in fair dealing was around parity, and that's actually worked really well. I think that's been clarified. So there are ways to clarify it, but nothing is perfect. But I think that there are known boundaries as to what's paid for, what's not paid for, and what's possible and what's not possible. But, sorry, Des.
No, it's fine. Of course, in this process, there's been back and forth between all experts. Professor Ginsburg did say that it was uncertain, but of course, there's 5 or 6 experts that we spoke with that wrote a paper also on the ALRC that stated it's not too uncertain, especially one professor, Matthew Sagg, who went through nearly every single fair use case in America and came out on the other side and said, actually, if you really look at the stuff, it's not that uncertain. We're more than willing to give a little way and say absolutely any kind of exception that's open-ended is going to have some uncertainty involved in it. There are plenty of people in Australia who say that fair use may actually be more certain than what we have now. And one of the biggest complaints of what we have now is, well, first of all, it's not working, and second of all, it's never used because people are so afraid. Yeah. And what good is an exception where everyone's too scared to use it? And actually, documentary filmmakers in America have been one of the best case studies for fair use. Has anyone heard of the statement on best practices for fair use in documentary filmmaking? It was released in 2005, and it was this huge effort by mostly an old professor, law school professor of mine, Peter Yazzie, but it was a huge conglomerate of lawyers and law professors, and then also about 50% were advocates in the filmmaking business. And they all came together and they came out with, It's nice, concise. I think it's 13 pages. Guidelines for what's considered fair use and what's not considered fair use in documentary filmmaking in America. And that's been picked up by insurance companies. One of the companies that's so risk adverse. And they picked it up and said, all right, if you follow these guidelines, we'll insure you. So, guidelines can be used. And they had, this case study is just fantastic. Like, it gives certainty. People are happy to use them. They feel comfortable using them. And it can happen. And I think going towards fair use and saying it's uncertain and that scaring people off is really not giving it the time and thought that it deserves.
No, I'll disagree with that.
Yeah, but
Up to you.
I just even listening to this and hearing your question before makes me feel like I have a foot in both camps. At one stage, I have had to had a fair use ruling. The barrister wouldn't put it on paper, but I was trusted their consultation because I needed to get something over the line because, like everyone says, it's uninsurable if it's you can't sort of build your film without having your insurance in place. So I've actually been through that horrific journey of stress and nights and nights and nights of sleeplessness over a 10-second clip that was vital to the film that fell under critique. But there's no. I didn't want to. Do you want to risk that? Do you want to deliver to all your, Anyway, it passed, so it was all okay. So I have faced that. But on the other hand. If fair use affected my work, I'd be upset if people were maybe using my work as fair use. It's hard to find that balance.
Veronica, could you maybe talk?
Filmmaker.
Yeah, as a filmmaker and someone who provides content and distributes into the education market, could you maybe talk a little bit about how important that market is for you and your experience of working within it?
Yeah, well, screen rights has been a really important part of our business, and we've got a lot of projects that go into the educational market, which we're thrilled about. People are watching them and engaging with them. Students are learning from them. And the screen rights royalties that are collected by screen rights are a really vital part and a rewarding part of what we do and part of our business, part of our business accounting to have income from that work. And then to sort of lose that would be a shame, I think, and that's what I see. I'm not quite sure. See, I'm confused as a filmmaker about what it means for me when I read and hear about this paper. Does it mean that I'll lose my screen rights? Yeah.
So there's 4 factors that you weigh up whenever you're trying to determine whether a use is fair, and these are coming from America. And the 4th one is the effect that it would have on the copyright holder's market. And so you guys are covered. If it's going to have this detrimental effect on your market, it will not be a fair use. And in terms of the educational use, if fair use was going to be involved and what effect that would have in the screen rights license, we think it would have very, very, very little effect at all on the screen rights license. And that's just because the use. Every single time you're trying to determine whether something is a fair use, you look at how it's being used and the effect that it's going to have. The way that schools use film and screen rights material is they use the whole thing, and they keep it in their schools, either on their intranet or their LMS or TMS. They keep it there forever, for ages. They don't get rid of it. That's never going to be a fair use.
I sit on the board of the Copyright Council, and one of the fellow directors is a fellow called Angelo Lakakis, and he's for the Society of Authors, and he's actually been part of the Google Books, the litigation there, and he was able to show that various of his books were put up by Google without his permission, and when he went to actually go to a publisher again, that they said, no, we're not interested because your book's already up on Google Books. And Google have said that that's a fair use. There's a case going on right now with what's called ARIO. It's a huge, big case on retransmission, and that's about a very, very clever company. And we'll speak about innovation a little bit later on around these issues, but a very clever company that's actually selling tiny little aerials which allow broadcast television to be retransmitted. ARIO charge a fee of $11, and there's no payment for the rights owners. And again, a fair use defence is being used for that, and where Screen Rights and the Copyright Council are actually being a friend of the court or looking at how we can assist with that. So just harm alone is not enough, and and Google says that. And I think the thing about all these copyright issues, having been around it for a little while, is it's always different when it's yours. That's the key to it. And copyright is about respect, and it's a permission-based system. And so if the joke always ends with and the rights owner's not paid, it's a bad joke. And I think that's not fair. I think fair's got to be around. We've got to have access. We've got to have flexibility. We've got to have innovation, and I'll speak a little bit about that more. But you've got to be able to have some mechanism to be paid.
Well, and I think the education sector will honour that. Obviously there's a lot of things in place to ensure that. And I guess the Google world is that most of my films are already out there somewhere. If you Google them, you can find, was it Pirate Bay and all those? Someone always finds a film somewhere. It's
Jessica, can I ask, with your dealings with schools, outside of the kind of screen rights models, do you feel that schools would still be willing to go out independently and spend the time to kind of find those licenses and secure that content outside of the current screen rights model? I mean, if people do need to be paid, we're hoping that educators actually take the time and the wherewithal to go and locate those rights holders and pay them. Do you think that, is your sense that time and care will be taken to do that?
Do you mean if the screen rights license wasn't there?
Yes.
Well, first of all, the screen rights license isn't going anywhere. Even if they,
I love hearing that.
Even if they did repeal the statutory licenses, we actually asked for repeal of the statutory license in our submissions, but we said we wanted it replaced with a voluntary license. The same collecting societies would still be there. The same arrangement would be there, where we're centrally negotiating these licenses, and we're still acting on their behalf. Screen rights is still acting on their behalf. So we don't want screen rights to go anywhere, because then that effort and that burden would be on the schools. I would like to think that they would, but it would minimize their content. I think it'd be a lot harder for them, and it'd take a lot of time. We certainly don't want that.
Sure. The difficulty is actually, with certain types of content, like the Motion Picture Association of America, for example, they would always want, to have their own licenses. So the thing is that that's a simplicity, and I should say that in terms of copyright citizens, schools are number one. They always want to do the right thing,
of course,
and they always do the right thing. Always. And I've been, have got a lot of experience around that, and so there's no issue around piracy that we're talking about. It's around access and simplicity. And the thing our teachers are facing, and we're dealing with teachers every day through enhanced TV and other mechanisms, is that they are faced with teaching a brand new curriculum. There's all this uncertainty, and the last thing they want to do is talk about copyright. They want to talk about content. They want to engage with that. They're totally up for that. But what we want to do is make it as simple as possible. So we see ourselves failing if we add confusion to that process, and we see ourselves failing if we don't give them a wide choice. And so we've got a big history of working together with the schools in adapting the license when it went from VCR to all of now that there's mechanisms they're called content management systems, and I can show you one later on, whereby schools can access all this content. It's cloud-based. They can put it on any device. It's got all this flexibility around it, and that's the type of conversation which we want to have, not what's in or what's out for somebody who's faced with 40 different people. And education is changing so much. And I don't know if people heard a podcast which was just last week around that was around future education. But this expert from Finland said that education is now like going to the doctor's surgery, where you're in where the teacher's almost like the doctor, and you've got 40 patients, and they've all got something different. But they need a different prescription. And it's the same with the education being personalised. So one kid might have special needs, another kid might need to be pushed a bit harder. And what you want to do is have as much material available as simply as possible, so the teacher can be that facilitator and the kids can drive that learning. And that's where we're coming from, a teaching and learning perspective.
And that's very much your experience as well, Jessica, that teachers want to be dealing with content, not having to worry about copyright.
100%. And I agree with everything Simon said. I mean, they want it simple, and they want it right there, and they want it easy, and they want as much as they can get. And in terms of simple, that's one of the reasons why we did support fair use, and we think that would make our Copyright Act much simpler and easier for them. And I know at first it seems like there is uncertainty around that much of an open-ended exception, but that's why you get guidelines, and there's actually more guidance in the U.S.-style fair use, which has been recommended, than what we have in our fair dealing right now.
I think you only got as far as the first fairness factor when you were listing them, though. I wonder if you could just list the other three.
Yep, so the one that I mentioned was actually the fourth one. First one is the scope and use. The second one, do you remember them all? I could ramble, and I know.
It's impact.
I want to get the actual right. Yeah, it's impact. No, it's a scope and the use. So basically, how much you're using and how you're using it. And the fourth one is the one that I previously mentioned, with the effect on the market.
Yep.
I have them written down over here too. If you want to
That's okay.
I raise it because these are the questions that educators will ask themselves potentially when using documentary sectors content in their teaching. So it's an important one to cover, I think.
Basically looks at, one of the examples that everyone always gives is what will never be fair use. It's if you're using something in the same manner that the original creator did. And so that's considered a transformative use. If you transform something and you make it your own and you're using it in a different manner, it's a big factor in what they're going to look at as to whether it's going to be a fair use or not. If you're using it in a manner that will replace or compete with the original work, it's almost always going to be scrapped as not a fair use.
And the difficulty is in establishing that. And I think that Google Books just shows, they've got all the power of the American Society of Authors, the publishers and so forth, and still they're unable to stand up to this institutional might. And it's it's one of the frustrating sort of things within the ALRC process was that the individual voice of teachers, of filmmakers, of non-institutional users was not necessarily given the same weight, and I think that's it's a complex debate, but I think that they could have done a better job with that.
I don't think that's true at all. I mean, we speak on the behalf of teachers and schools, and we spoke with hundreds of teachers, and they all said we want it simpler, and we spoke with them about fair use, and I gave numerous presentations on it, and so I don't think that's true that it didn't have as much weight. We were one of the main stakeholders, and we think that we were speaking as to what teachers and schools wanted, so I don't necessarily think that's true.
I was just going to ask if anyone else had made a submission themselves to the ALRC report, but perhaps I'll field that question from you, sir. But if you wouldn't mind just waiting for the microphone, please.
Hello, I'm Peter Tapp from the Australian Teachers of Media, and we put in a submission. And we discussed this at board level quite a bit and then went back to our members. And our main issue was the fact that it was more the writers or the producers of the material could possibly miss out along what Simon is saying, that there wouldn't be the royalty payments. And even though copyright is difficult, the way the system works now, most teachers know that if they're going to use articles, that they can download anything from television, or the school can, the audiovisual librarian, and use that in their classroom for education purposes. We also publish magazines, and we were concerned about whether we would lose the copyright to the articles in our magazines, which would completely destroy Atom, because we don't receive, we receive $6,000 now, government funding, and we're publishing 2 magazines, we're putting lots of study guides. If your fair use went through, Atom would probably go out of business. So we were concerned at the board level. We went back and spoke to all our membership and explained our concerns, and all the Atom members, pretty much majority, voted that we wanted to put in the submission to keep the system as it is.
And we didn't on the complexity thing, and there was a confusion between print and audio visual, because we go to schools, we do it together, and we've never ever heard in 25 years that the system which we have in terms of teachers know that they can copy any television program from any broadcast, they can copy it in any format, anywhere, anyhow. So we just don't buy that bit of the argument is complex. But
before I go, sorry, Jessica.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, did you want to respond?
I was just going to say I agree. The screen rights license is very straightforward, and schools love it. And I don't think that complexities necessarily around Part 5A
Yep.
of the Copyright Act, which is that.
We've just got another question here.
Sorry.
Hello, sorry. Kingston from the Australian Directors Guild. I actually fronted Jill and the panel from the Copyright Council with colleagues of mine, Angela Lakakis from the Australian Society of Authors, visual artists as well. And we were flabbergasted by the lack of understanding of income of content creators. And we came away from that meeting very, very worried. And of course, the result we think is, as you can hear from I oppose the fair use introduction because fundamentally it only does not serve any of the content creators in the long run. And I think it's important to understand is that we have no legal background, no case law in this country. And to establish case law in this area in the United States took many, many years. And so what will happen is that cases like the Google Books case will be just one of many. And the people without the resources, the individuals like the filmmakers, won't take those cases on because they won't be able to fight them, because they won't have the resources to do that. Hopefully, maybe their associations will if they can support them. But I think, as Peter just said, a lot of those organisations won't also be around because a lot of the support will disappear because of that. So it's very concerning, and it's very concerning because it really, I don't agree that we have a great system either. I think there has to be reform to the copyright system. I don't think there's anything. And one of the fundamental flaws of the LSE review is that it was supposed to be about the digital, opportunities for digital in the future and from an economic point of view. There was almost no economic analysis in the entire report. So I'm still trying to struggle. Where is the advantage? Where is the economic advantage of the change of system? And it didn't seem, unless someone could point it out clearly what the economic advantage is. It doesn't seem.
We thought every time they had to make a choice between the creator and an institutional user, they didn't ever jump on the creator's side. And we've looked at the report in great detail, and they're the choices that they've made. And that it has an academic elegance. But working through it it's going to be hell. And we certainly don't. I want to be absolutely clear. We're certainly not against access. We're not against innovate. We want all of those things to happen. Invest in it heavily. But we think that certainty and growth and partnership. And we just heard before Richard Finlayson just talking about Netflix and all those different sort of models which are happening. They're not happening because of fair use. They're happening because of licensing, and in the US there's over 100 video on demand services through licensing. Fair use isn't. There was this furphy which got repeated time and time again during the Law Reform Commission. Then they asked this question, and this is the sort of theoretical level the whole thing was gunning from. Could Google set up in Australia? This was the question they asked, and Hargreaves, who looked at it in England, just sort of said. Well, Google sort of had this model where they went around and very cleverly sort of said, well, let's ask this question in these different jurisdictions. And Hargreaves looked at it and he just sort of said, well, it's not a bunch of lawyers in a room that's driving the incredible innovation of Google. It's brilliant engineers. It's actually access to venture capital and those things. And he said that. He basically said, look, he said, does this mean that if only the UK could adopt fair use, East London would suddenly become a rival to Silicon Valley? And the answer to this is certainly not. There are other factors, and we've got to look at all those other factors.
Jessica, just on the subject of kind of furphies and misunderstandings, that was one question I did want to pose to both of you. Do you think that there was any instances where there was some kind of misunderstanding just around the report and some of the recommendations that you might want to address?
Yeah. Probably the biggest one that everyone keeps on talking about is fair use means that content creators and rights holders won't get paid. It's just not true. Like I said, that fourth factor is there specifically to protect the rights holders. There is conversation going on in America now whether fair use has gone too far. Congress is looking at that right now. Maybe it has. I don't know. But I certainly don't think that we should be afraid of fair use. Peter Yazzie, he spoke actually in the Congress hearing talking about whether fair use had kind of gone overboard in America, and he's baffled that people are so confused about it and scared of fair use. And he talks about how he calls fair use the secret sauce of Americans' content creation industry. And he's like, why don't other countries want this? Why are they so scared? And I think I'm on his side about that. It doesn't mean that content creators aren't going to get paid, and I think it recognizes public policy reasons to share content, and it encourages transformative use, and it still makes sure that the content owners get paid. So fair use certainly does not mean that no one's going to get paid for their content. Another misconception may be that, I think we kind of already talked about it, but schools aren't pirates. People think that fair use means there's going to be this rapid, piracy of everyone's content. That's just not going to, all I can speak for is educational use. It's certainly not going to happen. They want to pay for content. They're more than happy to. And the second part, or the last one that I briefly mentioned, is I've been involved in a couple law reforms here, mostly in America, and I have never seen one that has polarized what everyone's calling content users and content creators so much. And I think everyone uses content and creates content nowadays in the digital age. It's part of the environment and the world that we live in now. And we have this huge polarization of people fighting and people scared they're not going to get paid. And I just think that's really, really counterproductive. And, we're all on the same team here, and we're trying to figure out what's best for Australia to go forward. And I certainly think that's fair use.
I think the confusion comes around is that there's tens and thousands, if not millions of dollars on the line. And my screenwrites, I'm often trading them before I go into production. So I'm trading them at the finance plan stage. I'm already using them. They have value. We also have a footage library and clips. And, if people are just claiming fair rights on clips, Cyrus, where do you have an industry in that department? So I feel like that it's money's on the line. Yeah. There's lots of money on the line.
Just on the topic of money, you're absolutely right. I agree with you 100%, Brian. And just to give it kind of an indication, this is something that I pulled out of the final report. In 2012, the Australian school sector spent over $665 million buying educational resources, in addition to over $80 million in licensing fees to collection societies. So that's schools alone. To put this in context, the amount spent by schools and others on purchasing educational content is more than 7 times the amount Screen Australia received from the government in 2012, and more than 3 times the amount the Australian Council for the Arts received from the government in 2012. So these are massive sums of money and massive pools of money dedicated to educational resources, which is part of my kind of interest in the area. It's somewhere that I believe documentary can really grow and continue to serve. And it's a place that's hungry for content, good quality content that people in this room is creating and distributing.
And we've got to look at the size of the market overall. Like Gonski said, it costs between $8,000 to $10,000 to educate a kid. For $6.13, that's how much our licence is, for the whole year, educators can access all of that content. And a third of that goes to documentaries. So although it's $26 million in a pool of literally hundreds of millions of dollars, we tried to work out the percentage and it got to 2 zeros. But it is very important for the documentary sector. And we sort of dug a bit deep into our stats, and 64% of that went to Australian makers, and that is actually extraordinary because we've got to think about what's being broadcast, with the BBC, with National Geo, and for us as for screenwrites, the competition is about making sure that we promote Australian documentaries as much as possible, and that educators get great value for that. So I think that the individual figures, yes, it's important to look at those, but you've got to look at them in the context. And I think that it's really important that educators don't, and I'm certain, no, they don't feel this, but they don't think that documentary makers have to subsidise education and vice versa, that there has to be a fair payment. When we use words such as fair has to be around fair payment, not just around fair access. And Screenwrites has always seen itself as being a bridge around access and payment.
Jessica, do you maybe speak to that for a moment from your kind of dealings with schools? I mean, that they're very conscious that this money is going back to a documentary sector, an Australian documentary sector, that creators are being paid for this content?
Yeah, no, I think they are really aware of that. And so how we set our license fees every year is it's through surveying. And so certain schools we surveyed every year. And that's a big part of the surveying process. They go to the schools and they educate them on what's going on. And they always say, we need you to do this, we need you to comply with this, because this is how we give royalties to, this is how we pay the content creators. And so schools have they know that, and I think I think that really actually increases compliance in the survey. And so they are aware of that. In regards to the money, the $665 million that we spend buying content every year, that will not change with fair use. That is not, that's purchasing content, so purchasing books, purchasing films, purchasing all their different stuff that they need in their courses and in the classrooms. That'll never be touchable by fair use. Fair use will have more, if any, impact on the licensing fees. And like I said, I think that'll have very, very minimal on the screen rights license.
But the arguments about what is and what isn't fair, would that, if we're in court, that means less money for our members, and that's the thing about defining those boundaries, and you've got to work out what day one is, and whether or not US law is going to influence that. And in terms of uncertainty, I mean there are a lot of lawyers who can advise, just as happened with you, Veronica, about what is and what isn't a fair dealing, and they've invested a lot into that, and the fact that every night we watch the news and those provisions are being used successfully. And that gets me back to the first thing which you said, which is, what was the purpose of this inquiry? What is it that we want to do that we can't currently do? And I think that's actually a more exciting question, because from there questions of innovation and engagement come, as opposed to what you've sort of said is the narking around what is and what isn't. And we're as guilty as anybody with that. But I think that there's broader, more exciting questions to be asking.
Right. I'm conscious of the time we have remaining. I do want to put aside 5 or 10 minutes for any other questions I have. Simon, I think you've got something that you want to show in terms of the clip. I also want to just sort of pose a final question to the three of you, which is just basically, if you wanted to say one thing about documentary use in education, considering that we're at AIDC here, that there's got doco makers in the room, I'd like to hear what that is from your own perspectives. But maybe, Simon, you want to go to your...
So I've just talked a little bit about these resource centres, and basically the way resource centres work is that the copies can be made under the screen rights licence, and this is just one resource centre called Enhanced TV. There's another one called ClickView, which was voted the most innovative company by BRW, but this is the way it works. So we're going to use one of your... That's your project. So this is Compass. So basically there's 18,000 lessons there, 18,000 programs. This is all cloud-based. They don't need anything. It's available on tablets and so forth. Teachers can just search via... You'll see that there's closed captioning. Teachers can just search any individual word and get every single program up on that. They can turn the closed captions off. They can email a link of the program to the students. They can do it via Twitter. They can do it via Facebook. They all have to be licensed. And they're linked, all of these programs, and this is unique and wonderful, and Peter's been at the centre of this. They're linked to study guides that we have over 700, funded by Screen Australia. And so just click the link and they can download the study guide. And obviously classes only go for about 40 minutes, so teachers want to be able to just make their own clips. And this is this personalised education thing which I've been talking about, so that they can make a clip for 2 or 3 minutes. They can compare and contrast with other clips, share their lesson plans around, and insert that clip within a lesson, and then share their experience. And so this is all happening under the licence. This can only happen under the statutory licence. It can't happen via a voluntary licence mechanism. And companies such as ClickView, as I said, that they were voted the most innovative company by Microsoft. And so that's what we're talking about. These are the conversations we want to have. We want to get so much better at this. We want to deliver the national curriculum. We want Australian documentaries to be right at the centre of it. Teachers now get a choice as to the content that they use. this is the way in which it works. They have learning outcomes, and they get to choose, and we want them to choose this content, and we want to make that as easy and seamless as possible. So that's the journey that we want.
Thanks, Simon. Jessica, I mean, you know, we're documentary people in this room at AIDC. I just would like, just before we go to you, Matthew, just a final thoughts from you. You know, you're speaking to the education sector. It's really valuable to get your perspective. If you had kind of one thing to say to the documentary sector from your dealings with education in light of the report.
I think they want more content.
All right.
Create. I think they're dying for it. I get calls all the time, people trying to find more Australian content. I don't know if the US, if there's just that much more, or if it's just put in their face more, but they always complain about having too much US content and not enough Australian. So produce.
Brian, maybe if you could just have a final point just in your, you know, in terms of the work you do in the education market.
Well, it's really important. So, and I want it to continue to be really important financially. I'm a producer, and ka-ching. But it's also about eyes on screen. So it's having Australian stories for Australian kids.
Thank you, Matthew. Do you have a question?
Sorry, I didn't. Is this on? Oh yeah. I didn't mean to. I was going to interject in a bit of the conversation earlier, but I just, and maybe to touch on from the fabulous Veronica's last statement. Producing is bloody hard, and I think I've observed this because I'm not a producer, and I've just been spending a lot of time with the businesses that do it. And one of the things I've started out doing, and I sat with Jill in a forum which was a sort of a small forum in which it was very obvious. She started quoting a lot of Google research and talking about things, and I was like, So I invited Jill, who led the ALSA review, to the offices of Essential Media. And you think of, in this community, you think of Essential as this juggernaut. You know, it's, Chris has built this business and it's massive and doing so well, and it is, for an Australian business, it's doing incredibly well. They employ 20 people, and they're in an office that's not, you know, flash. It's just an office, and I shouldn't say that too loudly because you'll probably hit me, but it's, you know, it's a top floor of a building in West Sydney. And I knew that, and I wanted to take Jill to that environment because I think that the lack of understanding, to maybe Simon's point, and maybe the difficulty we have as an industry sometimes breaking through, is to convey the challenge of actually what our businesses are doing. And we have this sort of pyramid diagram we show where about half of the businesses in Screen Producers Australia are pretty much 1 or 2 person operations. They may employ about 200 people a year, but their actual day-to-day overheads are incredibly tight because there's only a couple of people. And that understanding and that overlay about actually how this creative industry in Australia works is the thing that I think frames all of this discussion. And it is indeed probably, we hoped it was one of the reasons why the final recommendation really sort of took a different direction with regards to screen rights, but it's still the reason we have a problem with where we're at with fair use, because you end up in a paradigm which is, if it's not fully understood, if you take Veronica off her game for half a day even to think about fair use, that's a whole heap of chaos in a business that can't operate other than at 50% that you're operating at. Yeah, and Veronica's one of the, you know, amazing, talented producers in this country, and you go, well, actually, if you do that to this industry across a whole heap of other type of legal challenge and chaos, you've actually decimated the industry, or you've had it roll over, basically, and say, well, we can't bother to fight, and our income stream does drop. I think that's the principle. It's taken me a while to get my head absolutely into the difficulty of where those businesses are, and I think that is still the challenge in conveying outwardly why something like fair use doesn't actually work in this system. We need a lot more certainty. Sorry to take up the last couple of minutes.
We've probably just got time for one more question from the back there.
Hello, it's Cyrus Irani from Library Sales at the ABC. I've got 2 questions. Can you explain how schools operate in the US? Can they actually record programs off air the way they do here? And could schools actually be disadvantaged? So I have an educational catalogue and I sell to schools who aren't members of Screen Rights. If there was a change, would schools be obliged to purchase from my catalogue and other companies' catalogues?
So the first question, in the US, actually the schools are disadvantaged. We're actually in a much better position with Screen Rights than what they are in America. We recognize that in our second submission. we kind of threw out the idea of if we did move to voluntary licenses, how would we get around the problem of all these underlying rights that are in broadcast and all these big issues, kind of like what Simon touched on whenever he said if we had voluntary licenses, we wouldn't be able to have enhanced TV. So we kind of threw out the idea of having like a statutory plug that allowed them to do that. Obviously, the ALRC decided not to go with repealing the statutory licenses and to keep them and just kind of rework them a bit. So, and we're happy with that. We knew that a pure voluntary licenses in terms of Part 5A would have been an issue. So, in terms of America, yeah, they're at a lot worse position in terms of
the guidelines say they can show it twice. I think it is or 3 times.
It's not good, and we knew that was going to be a problem.
And it's not enforceable. Yeah.
And so that's fine.
Format that.
Sorry?
Can you format your system? It's unreal.
Yeah, it's amazing. Well, Anna here, this is the editor of Enhanced TV, and
it's great, and that kind of stuff so important for schools, and schools absolutely love it. And so we were willing to give ground on that, and we're happy with where the ALRC's come out. That I think it'll work great with a little bit of reworking. And then the second question, I'm not sure what it was.
It was about direct licensing.
Schools could still direct license and do that instead of using the statutory license. That is something that the ALRC did say in the final report. So schools could do that, but the screen rights license is so well-rounded and so robust that I don't think there will be a whole lot of need for schools to do that. And we have a great relationship with screen rights, and so we get great negotiations, great licenses for the schools. So they could. I don't think there will be a need to.
Okay. I think we're going to have to wrap it up, folks. Thank you for your attendance. Thank you very much to the panel. Will you please put your hands together for them? And enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you. Thanks.